was asked today to speak about some of the legacies of the Dayton Peace Agreement and how they manifest themselves in contemporary Bosnia and Herzegovina. So as I said, please bear with me. Some of this is probably going to be extremely basic to some members of the audience, but it is still important to remember where some of the tensions today started. You probably all know that when we refer to Dayton, we mean the peace framework that was signed in November here in the United States, and that ended the 1992 to 1995 war. But sometimes we forget that Dayton was in a way just the outcome of quite a few negotiations and other agreements that were agreed during the conflict, most notably the 1994 Washington Agreement. We also sometimes forget that the war in Bosnia was extremely brutal and bloody, considering the size of the country. Over 100,000 people died, and given the fact that Bosnia had a 4.4 million population before the war, that puts things into perspective in terms of the scale of the war. Half of the population was displaced, so it was really no small achievement to sign a peace agreement that would finally stop the fighting, so to speak. Sometimes the agreement in Dayton is used in political science and international relations as a brilliant piece of diplomatic achievements. And people that have studied diplomatic history do look into Dayton to study all those 21 to 22 days of negotiations led by Richard Holbrooke to analyze, what could have been done differently, what parts of the agreement could have been different. The main three topics on the table were about, sometimes I call that 3 S's: the space, the territory, about Sarajevo, and then the structure, the system, the political system that Bosnia is going to be based upon. The negotiations in the end resulted in a compromise peace, as we all know, and for quite a lot of us, an unjust peace in terms of how the country was divided. However, most of these discussions that we have today about reforming Dayton, or Dayton Plus, or Dayton 2.0, and so on, it really focuses mainly on one part of the peace agreement, which is, I apologize, it focuses on Annex 4, which is the current constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sometimes we also talk about Annex 10, which is the civilian implementation of the peace agreement, which the High Representative was given. So firstly, let me focus on the most obvious legacy of Dayton, which is the governance structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in a way, the most consequential legacy. By some accounts, Bosnia has the most complex political system in the world. I would suspect that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly has an extremely inefficient governance structure. The territory, as we know, was divided into Republika Srpska and the Bosniak-Croat Federation, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it was based on far-reaching consociationalist principles. So those principles mean power sharing based on group rights, high levels of decentralization. Bosnia is an asymmetric federation, which again was part of the result that preceded Dayton rather than agreed within Dayton. It's also implemented a series of vetoes on vital issues, which have become some of the main stumbling blocks for the governments of contemporary Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as reserved seats. And that really created a consociationalist state that does not necessarily have an equivalent in the world, and is extremely complex because it has multiple layers of governance that sometimes overlap, and the Constitutional Court actually has to intervene multiple times to kind of clear those tensions up. Sometimes this structure is blamed for being, completely exogenous, completely kind of foreign to Bosnia. Partially that is true, partially that isn't true. Some of these institutions already existed in the former Yugoslavia, such as collective presidencies, and reserved seats even existed during the Ottoman Empire. So some of that already existed. And we also cannot forget that Dayton, in a way, incorporated what was already there, including the constitution of Republika Srpska that seceded and declared independence in 1992. It should be said that Dayton has evolved over time, and we do forget about that. So despite the fact that initially the central state was given only about 20% of the governing kind of rights, if you like, over the state, from 3 central level ministries, 7 more were added, more state level institutions were created. So Dayton and these structures did evolve. So Dayton is not as rigid as we sometimes seem to think. However, these interventions were mainly done through international interventions of the High Representative, or through interventions of the Constitutional Court. That has become extremely important, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about the role of the Constitutional Court within Bosnia and Herzegovina, whose decisions do get ignored, but it does set the tone for what needs to be done and reformed. Now, the next thing that is the most obvious legacy of the Dayton Constitution, as we sometimes call it, is the idea that we think about Bosnia as being ruled by 3 groups, as if it's not a country of citizens, of Bosnians, as if it's a country of 3 groups that were also the 3 fighting parties, if you like, during the war: the Bosniaks, the Croats, and the Serbs. And this is something that actually quite a lot of Bosnians themselves try to fight against. This is something that they dislike themselves. The problem was that at the time when the negotiations are happening, the main idea is to kind of represent these group-based rights, but the constitution at the same time wants to guarantee individual rights. But that has led to problems because the so-called others, who do not represent with these groups, or those who simply want to identify as Bosnians, have lost some political rights, active political rights, such as being elected to the presidency or to the House of Peoples at the state level in particular. There were issues at the entity level, but again, the Constitutional Court has actually intervened, and those were resolved in 2000. And so the most notable one is the 2009 decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which decided in the Sejdic and Finci case that the constitution basically violates individual political and civil rights, because these other groups that do not identify with the 3 dominant groups are not represented. And that is something that still has not been implemented, and that the High Representative tries to kind of get involved. Now, the next one, which is also quite clear, is that the current kind of territorial and spatial layout of Bosnia is still the result of what was decided and agreed upon Dayton. You may remember that maps were extremely important during the negotiations. Sometimes people would call this peace cartography of peace, that there was a lot of tension over certain territories. And we already mentioned Brčko in the beginning before some of you joined the discussion, and how Brčko, for example, became one of the critical apples of discord on which the whole agreement could have fallen. And so the decision was made to postpone the decision on Brčko, and that was then resolved, again, just temporarily through a series of arbitrations by 1999. And in a way, a Solomonic judgment that Brčko belongs to both entities, but does not actually belong to anyone in terms of the jurisdiction over it. Until now, it still remains to be seen how further on Brčko is going to be run. Currently, it has a mayor and a municipal assembly, so it's in a way run as a semi-independent city-state, if you like, within Bosnia. Now, the main tension, though, that this has created had to do with the multi-ethnicization of Bosnia, if you like. Because of the group-based rights that I already discussed, the idea that people would be able to return to their pre-war territories was in tension with what was decided. Because once you have group-based rights and power sharing institutionalized at the level of entities, if you included minority returns in the way that they were foreseen during the Dayton negotiations, you would, in a way, overrule the basis of vesting these power sharing rights. So now we really have 2 entities that act as if they are, semi-independent state that represent on the federation side Bosniaks and Croats, and on the Republika Srpska side Serbs. If the multi-ethnicization of the minority returns succeeded, then the group-based rights in a way lose traction, because why would Republika Srpska only elect a Serb representative, for example, who represents the others on those territories? And that is still the problem today. And the problem, obviously, is that minority returns have not succeeded in the way that we hoped for. And then the vast majority of refugee and displaced people returns after the war were to majority areas. And despite the fact that property was returned, a lot of people would simply sell the property and move out of those places. I also want to highlight, and this, which is probably most important for this type of gathering, is that some locations such as Srebrenica ended up on the Republika Srpska territory, which again kind of speaks to the idea of an unjust peace, because as we all know, a genocide was committed in Srebrenica. And then this territory, as well as some others, end up on the territory, such as Prijedor, end up on the territory of Republika Srpska. Now, the final two sets of legacies that I want to talk about is the role of international institutions, which is obviously, as we all know, extremely present in contemporary Bosnia. The High Representative, acting a bit as a dormant beast with high executive powers, has awoken, one should say, in the past year, and started making quite a series of contentious decisions, which I'm sure we will talk about. But again, this has actually not been necessarily we cannot necessarily blame this on Dayton, the role of the current High Representative. Yes, the role of High Representative was part of Annex 10 in Dayton, but not in terms of the vast executive powers that the High Representative then assumed. That was the result of the post-war development and of the Bonn powers and of the Bonn meeting decision at the end of 1997. But in addition to the High Representative, a series of other international organizations are still part of the governance of Bosnia. There is still military presence, and we all know now through the EU forces. We still have a series of international organizations assisting, sometimes cajoling, if you like, Bosnian institutions to run the state, and that remains an disputable kind of legacy of Dayton. Now, finally, transitional justice. Transitional justice is a really interesting part of the Dayton Agreement. It was the first agreement in a way that has written transitional justice all over it, if you like, through 70 references to human rights, through the fact that the ICTY has in a way acted as a tool of vetting, because as you see in this quote, no person who's serving a sentence imposed by the ICTY may stand as a candidate or be appointed to a public office. So thanks to this clause, in a way, quite a lot of the political leadership of the separatist Republika Srpska and Herceg Bosna were screened out from public life fairly soon after the war, once the indictments were published. So the ICTY, through Dayton, acted as a vetting procedure. Now, what is interesting is that the transitional justice that was written across Dayton focused mainly on refugees, prisoners, displaced persons, and then perpetrators of war crimes. It does not mention war victims per se. It does not really mention compensation, does not really mention any type of redress or reparations. And I think that's just a sign of the age of the time. At the time, really, transitional justice was mainly focusing on retributive types and legalistic kind of approaches to transitional justice rather than victim-centric one. So I know I'm running over my time, so I just wanted to give you a few of those quotes that we usually see. It's become a bit of a truism to say that, Dayton guaranteed peace, but it hasn't necessarily built a state. And I think my commentary to that would be that maybe the main fault of Dayton was to actually try to include a constitution. And we should not forget that the constitution was written in English. It was not written in Bosnian. It was written in English. So far, that really is quite unique in terms of peace agreements, to write a constitution in this way into a peace framework. So the puzzle that Dayton really leaves us is a series of puzzles, how to end a war without compromising a country's post-war development, how to accommodate conflicting political interests without blocking governance, as we see in Bosnia, how to negotiate with leaders who are implied in war atrocities, while ensuring justice and peace at the same time. So the justice versus peace debate is extremely prominent for the Dayton Peace Agreement. And how to provide international assistance without creating international protectorates, which obviously we know that Bosnia has often been labeled as. So I just want to end on saying that while Dayton is stricken with inconsistencies and contradictions, especially between the individual and group-based rights, as well as some vague formulations, it would really be unfair to pin all of this to Dayton. It was the product of the time in terms of the preceding negotiations, Washington Agreement, as well as Republika Srpska's constitution, for example, that were in a way adopted into Dayton, as well as some of the post-war development. So, you know, Dayton as we see it now is really not a 1995 product only. There were things that preceded it. There were things that follow it. It is true, though, that the high level of complexity and decentralization is the fundamental legacy of Dayton, but it was the result of these tense negotiations. But unfortunately, it solidified some of these tensions that were there in 1995. We still see very similar kind of group dynamics today, which is to the detriment of the overall governance that we're witnessing today. Thank you very much. And I apologize if this was too basic for some of you, because I realize the audience is very well informed.
Thank you so much, Jessie. We're going to turn now to Needham. Needham, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. I hope you can see me and hear me clearly.
Yes.
Yeah, so I will try to pick up from where Jessie stopped. And I would like to say that for understanding the current political moment, but also the history of the past 3 decades, it's useful to look at the trends in international governance and even trends in the world international, if you want, liberal order, because some of these trends explain how we got to where we are now and where we might proceed, at least in the near future. So currently, what people in Bosnia and what the political class is thinking about, and what it used a lot in the electoral campaign, we had general elections, by the way, in October. So much of it was focused on who do you know in the West? Who can you lobby to? Who can you mobilize for the support of our cause? So everybody claims that they have someone. It's a sort of a legitimization strategy. Now, this is not unique for Bosnia. In many other countries, we have seen political leaders portray themselves as allies or friends or of important political leaders. Even in such a self-dependent state as Israel, we have seen Benjamin Netanyahu, the king of Israeli politics, if you want, confirming his alliances and reiterating his partnerships with Russia or the United States. Now, in Bosnia, this is not unexpected, and there is a kind of path dependency because international governance was, as Jessie pointed out, in a way written in the Dayton Peace Accords. And what is going on, I claim, in the past 3 decades is that Bosnia is constantly being negotiated. Jessie used this term that the international presence cajoles Bosnian authorities to govern the country or to do some things. I mean, there's much truth to that, but I would say that Bosnia is constantly being under negotiation with the mediation of international presence in collaboration with domestic actors. And you can divide the post-war history of Bosnia into 3 main ages, or 3 decades, if you want, which roughly correspond to the political demands coming from the 3 main ethnic groups. Now, of course, it's not fair to reduce Bosnia only to the 3 constitutive peoples and to reduce its political life to what the 3 main political parties in the country currently are doing. But I will try to nuance on that, to nuance my explanation later. First, I would like to paint this picture of the first age of post-war Bosnia, if you want, 1996 to 2006, which you can call the age of high representatives. In this age, many institutions of the country were built. Many institutions were, some would say, imposed, because many of them were created by legislation that was not passed through the Bosnian or the entity parliaments, but rather imposed by the High Representative, and in particular, one High Representative, Paddy Ashdown. Now, not only were the institutions created in this first decade, but a groundwork for prosecution of war criminals and the return of refugees was laid out. And indeed, many advances were made in this front. This is often forgotten. The number of people, when they report, Bosnia gets much bad rap because it is often reported on how many people remain unprosecuted. Rarely it is reported that more than 1,000 have been prosecuted. Rarely it is reported that at least a similar number is undergoing investigation. So the effects of this first decade remain sort of underreported and underappreciated, if you want. Now, during the whole first decade, it was actually the Serb and the Croat leadership at the time who claimed that everything that is done is too much, that everything that is done weakens the power of the constitutional people, weakens Dayton, creates a unitary state, that there is not only a little legal ground for this, but that this is politically unsound, unwise, that it won't work. And Bosniaks felt at the time, or at least their leading parties, SDA and SB, they felt that what is done is not nearly enough, which is why when the April package of the constitutional reforms, which happened in 2006, was rejected, it was rejected by Bosniak parties who felt that a whole new renegotiation of the constitutional structure was needed. Now, mind you, ethnic rights in Bosnia are constituted, or rather constitutionalized, in two manners, one of which is territorial, and the other is also national through ethnic quotas. So there are two layers, if you want, which are used to protect the constitution. And the Bosniaks, in short, wanted this, either of the layers, if possible both, but wanted either of the layers stripped. And this event, the fall of the April package, which happened in 2006, marks the end of the first era. And this was the era in which the international community really existed between 1996 and 2006, when the US created Dayton. Some people called it Pax Americana, but this Pax Americana had a strong international component to this. Yes, the US were drafting, but the US had in mind that other nations would participate in international governance of post-war Bosnia, if you will. And partially, the US were also driven by very practical reasons. Who will finance the reconstruction? They were aware that the US alone cannot do it. And what started from 2006 was actually the beginning of cracks in the international community, which became unable to speak to Bosnia with one voice. Usually it was said that it is a problem that Bosnia is unable to speak with one voice due to diverse foreign political orientations of its political parties. But in reality, the first crack came when the US and the EU and the UK started having diverse views on whether this office of the High Representative should be closed or not. Most EU countries believed, and UK was in the EU, mind you, at that time, most EU countries believed that this is undemocratic, that country is not fit to be a candidate with this international presence. The US and the UK, on the other hand, believe that the OHR presence is, well, important for their own geopolitical presence, I think. And because they, in particular the US, should be the guarantors of security. And in this time, what happened was, or at least it is perceived to be so, a successful lobbying on the part of the Serb political leadership, which has managed first to convince the European Union that Bosnia does not necessarily have to be constitutionally reformed in order to join the country. And second, that its presence is a counterweight to Bosniak domination, that these quotas might be slow, that they might be, that they make country inefficient, that this territorial organization might look, as we saw on the quote that Jesse posted, might make the country look like Frankenstein, but actually that this is useful, that all this balancing seems to be useful to stop what could be perceived as a increased political influence from the Bosniaks, who wanted domination, and in the narrative of the Serb parties wanted domination in order to create an Islamic state. Very little evidence exists for this. because the internal cleavage among the Bosniak political parties and the political support that non-Bosniak candidates tend to enjoy among the Bosniak body politic presents us the opposite trend, presents us this, I would say, sometimes healthy, sometimes unhealthy internal political struggle within the Bosniaks, which themselves seem to transition from a more to less secular or religious orientation. Be that as it may, it would take us too far to discuss it now in detail. The point is that they succeeded, and that from 2006 to 2016, this rhetoric, Republika Srpska will have a referendum. I think Gerard Toal wrote a wonderful paper which is called exactly that. That basically this rhetoric was, on the one hand, you would have Milorad Dodik, the leader of the Serb Alliance of Independent Social Democrats, the leading Serb party, you would have him say this, and then you would have the next day the U.S. embassy or EU delegation presence press release with the statement, well, the US and the EU support the territorial integrity of the country. Well, of what use is that to Bosniaks when they view secession as an existential threat, having been the victims of genocide in Srebrenica, Prijedor, but also in other places in the country? Which is why this certain resentment in this period started to develop among the Bosniaks, who then view themselves as being basically, well, I wouldn't say ghettoized, but increasingly isolated. At this particular time, another important development happened, which is that the EU itself raised the bars. So not only did it care about the closure of the OHR, but due to events that are pretty much unrelated to what happened in the country, but rather what happened in Hungary, in Poland, and Romania with the rule of law backsliding, the EU then started to make what I think are pretty unrealistic demands, not just towards Bosnia, but the remaining 6 Western Balkan countries, where it would arbitrarily declare what rule of law is or isn't, what rule of law is useful or isn't useful for, which made the prospect of European integration even less relevant. And this is important because many of the civil society people in the country and the activists who were rightly funded to act as watchdogs imagine the European integration as a kind of a morality play, where if you're good and if you do nice reforms and if you prosecute people responsible for political corruption, you will advance on this path to membership. And they always understood path to membership as democratization reforms in the widest and the most positive sense. What they and many other observers unfortunately lost track of is this incredible importance of EU structural and cohesion funds. Back in 2008, the level of salaries in Bosnia was higher than that in Romania and Bulgaria. I worked in the parliament that as a young lawyer, and I remember quite well listening to Bosnian parliamentarians who were supported by USAID and sent to Bulgaria to observe the work of the Bulgarian parliament, remarking, but my God, I mean, these people have joined the EU 2 years ago, and yet we have better salaries than them and we have a higher standard than them. So it was not, this difference now still exists, but is unfortunately in the favor of Bulgaria and Romania, which are now due to not just the funds, but also the ability to undertake economic reforms because their progress to the EU was meaningful and not full of useful obstacles. That's the reason why basically these countries have made important economic development. Nowadays, what you see in Bosnia, you see civil society representatives arguing that precisely it is wrong for the country to advance towards the EU because that would be considered a reward for the corrupt political elite. What they fail to understand is without the progress towards the EU, there is little incentive for non-corrupt political elite to be engaged in the political process at all. And finally, there is a third age of the Bosnian politics, which started, you could say, in 2016, 2017 with the BiH Constitutional Court's judgment in the so-called Ljubic case, named that after the Croat political leader who submitted an appellation claiming that the constitutive peoples are electoral units in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina as one of its entities, meaning that effectively the formation of government must be correlated by the percentage of the votes cast by Croats in units where they constitute a majority, done for political purposes and supported owing much to the lobbying made by the current Croat government in both the United States and elsewhere. This ruling has been codified by the current High Representative Christian Schmidt, who used the bone powers to change the Constitution of Federation, thereby defending this quota. Now, critics of this solution say that basically in so doing, Schmidt made any prospect of future changes or constitutional reform or the incentive to create multi-ethnic political parties less likely to happen. Be that as it may, I think a more important lens of thinking about this is that this perception, and to what extent it is true, I can take in the Q&A if someone is interested in this perception that this was done because Croatia was in position to lobby for the interests of Bosnian Croats in the United States. So there is this perception that the governance of Bosnia is elsewhere. You know, there are talks now of whether the High Representative will impose legislation governing the usage and management of state-owned property. Now, I won't get into the legal details of this, but this would be an ideal workshop material for any negotiation workshop on politics anywhere and any college, anywhere in the world, because there are interests to all political parties and to all sides that this law is passed. But nobody is thinking that way, and nobody thought that way in the last 12 years, 10 or 12 years, that you should have some sort of a domestic initiative. Instead, what's being done is heavy lobbying for this or that legislative solution to come from the cabinet of Christian Schmidt. And finally, I will conclude with this. Whenever efforts were made to work, as they would say, to reach out across the aisle, to work with moderate parties or to work with moderate leaders, this was often labored as, traitorship. And this rhetoric of victimhood and this rhetoric of betraying your own national interests and being a foreign agent is ever present. Everybody's, especially, I have to say, among the Bosniak, there is not anyone who has not been labeled, anyone significant who has not been labeled a foreign agent or something or someone. So that also contributed to a lack of, domestic agency and initiative in resolution of many of the country's problems. But I think that this foreign lens and this sort of 3 decades approach, where this last decade is what you could call the Croat decade, because the Croat demands are in the forefront, just as in the first post-war decade, the Bosniak demands were in the forefront, or in the second decade, the demands of the Serbs in the forefront are, it leaves us little hope that there will be, hopefully from 2025 or 26, a 4th decade in which the demands of those who do not declare themselves members of an ethnic group will come to the forefront, that there will be meaningful progress on the path to European integration. Now that we see Biden administration having more understanding towards European integration, that for example, people during the Obama administration had. But we will see whether that happens. For now, international presence and this conviction that lobbying is everything and domestic negotiations are nothing dominates the landscape.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to our third speaker, Hikmet.
So much, Jim, and it's really great to see a huge turnout tonight. It's evening already, so it's early morning in the US. I'd like to again continue where Nedim and Jesse left off. Both of them are my friends from Sarajevo. So basically, two things which I want to underline. Firstly, Nedim correctly noticed and underlined that 2006 is the turning point in modern Bosnian history. The year when the elections which were held in 2006 brought two major actors, Milorad Dodik and on the other side, Aris Selajic, changed the political landscape in Bosnia since that time. And today what we have is a continuity of a crisis. And to some extent, we have been living, people in Bosnia, living in a constant crisis. Crisis is our new normality, basically. So in 2006, during the elections, Haris Selajic, the former Bosnian former foreign minister, promised the deletion of and the abolishment of Republika Srpska in order to get votes, while Milorad Dodik promised secession or independence of Republika Srpska and managed to get a Serb vote. The fact of the matter is 16 years later on is that Milorad Dodik is still in power, whereas Selajic is in retirement and not being able to do much of anything that he basically promised. But nevertheless, played on the fears of Bosniaks and Serbs at the same time in order to get the elections in 2006. What we have seen since 2006 is a constant political and economic crisis which have been going on and which have heightened in the past 2 years, which have led to the large polarization of the political security situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When we talk about the economic situation in Bosnia, what we need to know is that firstly, Bosnia is a former communist state, as all of you know. Secondly, is that its entire economic landscape was destroyed during a 3.5 brutal war in Bosnia. Looking at the images from Ukraine today, I can see that the level of destruction in Bosnia was much more higher. The level of looting, not only of state property but also personal property, was much higher during the Bosnian War than it is today, and also again in relation to the mass atrocities and genocidal campaigns which were committed in Bosnia. It was much more brutal, much more horrific than what we're seeing in today's Ukrainian conflict. So 15 years later on, what we had in Bosnia after the establishment of the very complex governmental system, Jesse very well explained to us, is that we have a large public sector, a large multiple governments, a very limited private wealth among the citizens, and a very weak export sector. So the rebuilding, and even those factories and those firms, pre-war firms, which did survive the war, were destroyed by the new political elites in the post-war period, who through privatization, very curious and privatization effort, became the majority leadership and ownership of Bosniak and Bosnian elites in the country. The other thing which drastically affects not only the economic, political situation in Bosnia and people's everyday lives is something which is called legal formalism, which we have in Bosnia, which is basically very similar to all former socialist states, and that is the extensive use of legal, very narrow legal interpretations of norms in order to get away with justice, in order to get away with any sort of accountability. This is both seen in corruption cases and also in war crimes cases. For example, Bosnian Croat president or former leader, currently one of the main leader, Dragan Čović, he had at least 3 major corruption cases in Bosnian court. For example, in one of the major court cases which he had, the main evidence, which was a document, got lost on the way from the prosecution office to the judicial court building. So which is basically 200 meters away, and it got lost on the way by the local police car. And the local court did not want to accept a photocopy of the document because it wasn't a court verified copy. So according to this reason, Dragan Čović, the Bosnian Croat leader, was not convicted for corruption cases. In other issues, for example, for war crimes, you can get away with standing trial by having just a doctoral letter stating that you are mentally challenged or incapable of standing court, or that you are sick or whatever, and you will be able to not attend and prolong your court cases, but at the same time you can go and to a nearby mountain and go for skiing, for example, at the same time. This is being done by major war criminals and other corruption suspects. What you also have besides this is a large political influence in the judicial system, which affects not only the different political and corruption cases, but also war crimes cases. And this is the same thing with all levels of government and judicial institutions, except for the Constitutional Court, where we have the exception of having foreign judges there. And basically the foreign judges which are in the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina are the ones which are keeping things intact so far. That is why the Constitutional Court is being a target of political elites, most notably Milorad Dodik and Bosnian Serb leaders, because they want to get rid of the foreign judges in order to overvote the other members of the court's certain decisions. This was the same issue with the court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there were foreign prosecutors and judges up to 2012. And since 2012, we've seen a drastic fall in the quality of cases going on there. I'm not saying that all foreign judges and prosecutors were good and were effective, but it did have some sort of oversight in the court system. The other issue that is very, very clear in Bosnia is the mass brain drain of young people going away from Bosnia, moving to Western Europe, and the very increasing depopulation of Bosnia going on, and which is very drastic, and which is probably the most important issue that we have in Bosnia today. To that extent that Bosnia will probably have to import construction workers in the next year or so, because Bosnia is currently lacking in skilled workers. The borders of Bosnia are weak to that extent that Bosnia is very vulnerable to illegal trade, human trafficking, drug trade, arms trafficking, and so on and so forth. And of course, very recently, 2-3 years ago, the massive migrant crisis which were going on in this region, and Bosnia was the main route through the migrants were moving towards. Another aspect is that former human rights violators who took part in mass atrocities during the war became, and still are to some extent, senior members of governments on multiple levels in Bosnia. So from the municipal levels to state and state government ministries and so on and so forth. So, for example, the former Bosnian Serb president Berislav Paravac is currently on trial for war crimes committed during the war in Bosnia. In other cases, you have former war criminals who did their time and have come back and rejoined public institutions in the country, which is the case, for example, in Bosanski Shamac, where one former ICY convicted perpetrator has come back to basically the same workplace where he committed and participated in the crimes in Bosanski Shamac. So all in all, what we have currently is a very drastic, not only economic or political situation, but also a very, very important note, a security crisis currently. The massive influence of Russia and China, Russia through its milling influences on Serbian politics in Serbia, but also in Bosnia, and China through its well-known methods of using their foreign influence in getting loans, basically not investments but loans to Bosnian government and public sector here by building bridges, mini hydroelectric dams and things like that. They are going to definitely influence not only the political but also the economic situation in Bosnia, and that's something which definitely needs to be addressed in the future. And this helps create kleptocracy basically in Bosnia, where you have these political actors from multiple sides who are very prone not only to corruption from the local level, but also to corruption from foreign influences. And that's something which we're seeing very, very much in the recent times. Russian oligarchs who are coming to Bosnia very frequently, night wolves, different Russian and Chinese not only state officials, but also some sort of private sector coming to the country and participating in political, economic events, but also taking part in historical revisionism, which is a playbook of Russia and China in Europe currently. So this is basically my short presentation, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A.